An 8-year-old girl walked into a shopping center restroom and never came out alive. One moment, she was laughing with her siblings, excitedly talking about a school dance routine. The next, she was gone. A routine stop at the mall turned into a nightmare. Her family was just a few feet away, waiting, unaware that behind a locked door, something was happening that would haunt them forever. Nothing about that day seemed unusual. Nothing felt off. Shoppers moved in and out, running errands. Parents held their children's hands. Teenagers browsed the aisles. But somewhere inside that mall, someone was watching, waiting. A predator hidden in plain sight. Inside Big W, Sophia asked to use the restroom. Her uncle said yes. He watched as she walked toward the restrooms, a few steps away, a safe distance. She wasn't scared. Why would she be? This was a public place filled with families, security cameras, and store clerks. She walked in. The door closed behind her. And just like that, she vanished. Minutes passed. Too many minutes. Her family waited, expecting her to come back any second, but she never did. Her brother knocked on the door. No response. They checked the men's restroom. Empty. The women's restroom. Empty. But the accessible restroom? It was locked. Water ran inside. There was movement. But no Sophia. Then, a voice answered from behind the locked door. But it wasn't hers. This was the moment their world shattered. This is the story of Sofia Rodriguez-Urrutia Shu, a child full of life, a child who should have been safe. But behind that door, something unthinkable happened. But before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank you, my incredible viewers and subscribers. Your likes, shares, and thoughtful comments don't just support this channel. They help keep these stories alive. If you're new here, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and become part of this growing community that believes every story deserves to be told, and no victim should ever be forgotten. Now, let's get into it. Sofia Rodriguez was the kind of child who made the world feel lighter. She was only 8, but her joy, her laughter, it filled every room she walked into. Born on November 11th, 1997, in Perth, Australia, she was the second youngest in a family of 4 children. Her world revolved around her parents, her siblings, and their family dog, Cookie, a small, scruffy bundle of fur that she absolutely adored. She grew up in Canning Vale, a quiet suburban neighborhood where kids played outside without fear, where parents let their children walk a few feet ahead in the grocery store because nothing bad ever happened here. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Her father, a businessman, often traveled back and forth between Hong Kong and Australia, leaving her mother to hold down the fort, a devoted stay-at-home mom who made sure her children had everything they needed. And Sophia? She was the kind of child who didn't need much to be happy. A simple bedtime story, a dance routine with her friends, a belief in the magic of Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. She was innocent in the purest way, completely unaware that the world had dark corners. But June 26, 2006 was a Monday and a school day just like any other. Sophia woke up excited that morning, buzzing about a new Indonesian dance routine she had been chosen for at school. She couldn't wait to tell her uncle and siblings about it later. Maybe, if she practiced enough, she could even teach Georgia and Natalia, the 2 best friends she spent almost every day with. She wore her school uniform, ate breakfast, and waved goodbye to her mother as she rushed out the door. Her school, Mater Christi Primary, was only a short drive away. It was a place she felt safe, surrounded by teachers who adored her and classmates who would later describe her as kind, funny, and full of life. By mid-afternoon, the school bell rang. Another normal day in the books. Her uncle was waiting to pick her up, just as he always did. Her older siblings were with him. They all piled into the car, laughing, chatting, completely unaware that this would be the last time Sophia would ever leave her school. Their next stop? Livingston Marketplace, a small, family-friendly shopping center in the heart of Canning Vale. A quick errand, nothing unusual, nothing to be afraid of, or so they thought. Inside the shopping center, everything was normal. Customers moved in and out of stores, cash registers beeped, music played softly over the speakers. Sophia, still full of energy from her school day, walked alongside her uncle and siblings, talking non-stop about her upcoming dance routine. She was so excited, using her hands to describe the moves, giggling at the thought of performing in front of everyone. It was a moment frozen in time, a moment of pure innocence, the last moment before everything went wrong. But as they walked into Big W, Sophia tugged at her uncle's sleeve and told him she needed to use the restroom. He glanced at the entrance, just a short distance away, fully visible from where they stood. He nodded, letting her go. She walked toward the restrooms, her school uniform slightly too big for her tiny frame, her backpack bouncing with each step. She wasn't scared. Why would she be? She was 8, and moreover, this was a public place. There were cameras, store employees, and families everywhere. But there was also someone else, someone watching, someone waiting. And the moment Sophia walked through that restroom door, the world outside kept moving. Customers kept shopping, her family kept browsing. Time didn't stop. But for Sophia, it did. However, her uncle and siblings continued shopping, moving toward the checkout lines. They weren't in a rush. They had no reason to be. But then, minutes passed, too many minutes. Sophia wasn't back. At first, no one panicked. Maybe she was just taking her time, fixing her uniform, washing her hands. But then 5 minutes became 6. 6 became 7. Her older sister glanced toward the restroom entrance, expecting to see her walking out. Nothing. "Where's Sophia?" They walked toward the restrooms, their pace quickening now. The men's restroom, empty. The women's restroom, empty. But the accessible restroom? The door was locked and water was running inside, and then movement. A sound. Someone was inside. So Sophia's brother knocked. "Sophia?" But there was silence, and he decided to knock again, only harder this time. Indeed, a voice answered, but it wasn't Sophia. It was a man. Something was wrong. A stranger's voice, a locked door, no sign of Sophia. So for a split second, there was confusion. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she had already left, wandered into another store. Maybe she had walked out another exit and missed them. But deep down, something didn't feel right. Sophia's brother's heart started pounding. He called out again, "Sophia?" Nothing. The voice from inside spoke again, a man's voice. When the door was finally unlocked, it swung open slowly, almost too casually, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. And then, he stepped out, a pale, overweight man, early 20s, awkward, uncomfortable looking. His eyes darted for a second, locking onto Sophia's brother. That moment, it couldn't have lasted more than a second, but it felt like forever. Because in that second, something felt off. The man didn't look confused, didn't look like someone who had accidentally walked into the wrong restroom. He looked like someone who needed to get out. And he did. Yes, he turned and walked away quickly. Not running. Running would have drawn attention. But his pace wasn't normal either. At that split second, Sophia's brother's instinct screamed at him that something wasn't right. He hesitated for a second. Should he chase him? Call for help? But something stronger pulled him the other way. He had to actually confirm that his sister was with him there. So he turned toward the open door, and that's when his world shattered. Inside, the small bathroom felt too quiet, and in the middle of it was Sophia. Her small, fragile body lay on the cold tiles, lifeless, crumpled, motionless. She was naked, and her school uniform, the one she had been so excited to wear that morning, was stuffed inside a sanitary bin, discarded like it meant nothing. Sadly, she wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. For a split second, his brain refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. Number, not Sophia. She was just here. She was just laughing. She was just alive. Or this wasn't real. But reality didn't wait. It crashed into him with a force so strong it knocked the air from his lungs. And then the screaming started, and desperation sets in. So he ran, and his legs moved before his mind could even catch up. He ran down the corridor and ran past shoppers who had no idea that a nightmare had just unfolded feet away from them. When he screamed, "Help! Help!" people turned, and heads snapped in his direction. But he wasn't stopping to explain. All that was in his mind was his uncle. He needed to get to his uncle. He found him near the checkout line, still waiting, still not knowing. "Sophia." He could barely get the words out. She's... He didn't have to finish the sentence. The look in his eyes said it all. And then everything erupted. Shouts, movement, panic. They rushed back to the restroom. The accessible stall door was still wide open, the scene inside unchanged, except now it was real. His uncle knelt beside Sophia, shaking her, calling her name. Nothing. He checked her pulse. Nothing. People started gathering. Whispers turned to gasps. The shock was contagious, spreading through the shopping center like wildfire. Eventually, someone called security, and another has called the police. Implication? The entire shopping center was going into lockdown. But the man who had walked out of that stall, he was already gone. And for a brief moment, he was just another face, another shopper. Another man walking through the parking lot, and no one knew they were looking at a monster. His name was Dante Arthurs. He was 21 years old, a night shift worker at the very same shopping center where this horror had unfolded. And he lived just down the road. He wasn't a stranger to this area. He wasn't some unknown figure lurking in the shadows. He was part of the neighborhood, and yet, no one knew what he really was. Not yet. Because this wasn't his first time. 3 years earlier, in 2003, an 8-year-old girl was walking home in Canning Vale, the same quiet suburban neighborhood where Sophia had lived. She didn't know it yet, but someone was following her. She was just a child, too young to know the weight of the world, too innocent to sense the danger creeping up behind her. And then, in an instant, he grabbed her. A hand clamped over her mouth. Arms, strong and heavy, dragged her into the bushes. She fought. She struggled. But he was bigger and obviously stronger, so he groped her and violated her. But he didn't expect one thing. She bit him, and she bit him hard. In fact, hard enough to make him let go. And the second she was free, she ran. No, she didn't stop. She didn't look back. She ran home, shaking, breathless, sobbing. And when she got there, she told everything. And because of this, the police came, and the investigation began. And for a moment, it seemed like justice was coming. Dante Arthurs was arrested. It should have ended there. It should have been over. But it wasn't. And as some would even point out, this was where the system failed because the evidence was right there, and the victim's blood was on his shorts. This was a direct link and an undeniable proof. And yet, they never tested it. The one thing that could have put him away, the one thing that could have proven his guilt without question, they ignored it. Instead, the case collapsed. Police had forced a confession, something that, legally, couldn't hold up in court. And because of that, the charges were dropped. Dante Arthurs walked free. No record, no conviction, no consequences. And just like that, he was back in the world, a predator with no leash, no restrictions, no watchful eye on him. And 3 years later, Sophia paid the price. Because if they had done their job, if the system had worked the way it was supposed to, if one single test had been run on that evidence, Sophia would still be alive. But they didn't, and so she wasn't. And now, a family was left shattered, a community was left reeling, and a monster had finally been unmasked. But this time, he wouldn't walk away. But by the time police arrived at Livingston Marketplace, the scene was already swarming with chaos. Shoppers were being ushered out, employees were frozen in shock, and Sophia's family stood there, numb, unable to process the horror of what had just happened. The accessible restroom was sealed off, turned into a crime scene. Every inch of it was examined, every possible clue was collected. But then came the first major problem. The surveillance cameras near the restroom? Not working. There was no footage, and there was no way to see who went in or who came out. No video proof of anything. It was a devastating setback, one that meant they had to rely entirely on witnesses. And thankfully, they had one, and that was Sophia's brother, because he saw the man who walked out of that restroom. And his description? It was unmistakable. A pale, overweight man in his early 20s, wearing a baggy shirt and jeans, walking way too fast toward the exit, eyes darting, shoulders tense. Police took that information and started checking every single person who had been at the mall that day. And very quickly, one name stood out. Dante Arthurs, a night shift worker at the shopping center. He was a man with a record, a man who, just hours after the attack, was suddenly nowhere to be found, and that was enough to get started. By 5 a.m. the next morning, police were at his house. The house was quiet when officers knocked on the door. Dante's parents answered, groggy, confused, completely unaware of what their son had done. But when police stepped inside, they knew they were in the right place. They went straight to his room, and there, tucked away in a bag, was something truly disturbing. Inside, they found latex gloves, handcuff, a small knife, photographs of young girls. But these weren't random pictures. These were carefully collected, and some of the photos even had names, ages, addresses. Now it was so glaring that Dante wasn't just acting on impulse. No, he had systematic plans, and Sophia wasn't his first target. And the most horrifying realization? If he hadn't been caught, she wouldn't have been his last. Thankfully, they found him in his bedroom. He was lying in bed, calm, like he hadn't just committed one of the most unimaginable crimes in Western Australia's history. But the second they told him to get up, he didn't resist. He didn't ask why, and he didn't argue. He just stood up and let them take him. And that chilled officers to the bone, because it wasn't the reaction of someone panicking. It wasn't the reaction of someone who had made a mistake. It was the reaction of someone who didn't care. So, inside the station, he sat in the interrogation room, staring at the table, refusing to make eye contact. At first, he denied everything. "I don't know what you're talking about. I wasn't there. I didn't do anything." But then, when officers laid out the evidence, when they told him they had his description, when they told him they had already searched his house, his story changed. Now he didn't remember. He was confused. He wasn't sure what had happened. And then, when they pressed him harder, when they refused to let up, that's when he finally said it. "I never meant to kill her." And that's when the room went silent. That's when officers felt the weight of what he had just admitted, and that was the moment they knew. They had their killer. But there was something else. For years, whispers circulated that Dante Arthurs wasn't who he claimed to be. The theory spread like wildfire. Was he actually Robert Thompson, one of the two boys who had brutally murdered 2-year-old James Bulger in the UK back in 1993? The speculation wasn't just paranoia. Arthurs had lived in England for 8 years before returning to Australia, and when side-by-side comparisons were made, his resemblance to aged-up projections of Thompson was unsettling. People questioned how someone so young could commit a crime so violent, so methodical, unless he had done something like this before. The theory only grew stronger when details of his past offenses surfaced. His 2003 attack on an 8-year-old girl, the disturbing contents of his home, the way he had targeted Sophia as if he had done it before. To many, it felt like more than just a coincidence. But as the rumors gained traction, the British High Commission and Western Australian police quickly shut them down, issuing firm statements that Arthurs was not Robert Thompson and had no connection to the UK case. Even so, the damage had been done. The idea that a child killer could disappear into a new life, only to re-offend in another country, struck a nerve with the public. Could it happen? Had it already? These were the kinds of questions that kept the theory alive, despite official denials. In the end, the truth about Arthurs was horrifying enough. He didn't need to be Robert Thompson to be a monster. The trial of Dante Arthurs was never just about proving guilt. It became a painful reminder of how many times the system had failed. Not just Sophia, but every child who should have been protected from men like him. It was about exposing a justice system that allowed a known predator to walk free in 2003, a system that ignored the warning signs and, in doing so, sealed the fate of an innocent 8-year-old girl. Now, even as the truth was laid out in court, that same system seemed prepared to fail her once again. The case against him should have been airtight. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses placed him at the scene, his past crimes painted a disturbing pattern, and the brutality of the attack left no doubt as to what had taken place behind that locked door. There was no question about what happened, no question about who was responsible, and no question that this man deserved to spend the rest of his life behind bars. But then, as the case moved forward, the cracks in the justice system began to show. When prosecutors formally charged Dante Arthurs, the list of crimes reflected the unimaginable horror of what had been done to Sophia. Willful murder, because this was not an accident, not a moment of lost control. This was deliberate. 2 counts of violating a child, because what had happened inside that restroom went beyond murder. Unlawful detention, because she never had a chance to escape. On paper, it seemed like a clear path to conviction, a case that should have resulted in the maximum sentence possible. But the system had already failed Sophia once before, and it was about to fail her again. But as the case progressed, the prosecution made a decision that sent shockwaves through the community. They dropped the most serious charges: no willful murder, no sexual assault charges. Why? Because the law required proof that Sophia was alive before the assault took place. Let that sink in. They had her broken bones, they had the crushed larynx, they had the bruises, the forensic evidence, the sheer brutality of it all. But none of it mattered, because they couldn't prove whether she was breathing when the assault began. And just like that, one of the most monstrous parts of this crime was erased from the charges. The public was outraged. People flooded radio stations, newspaper columns, and online forums, demanding to know how this was even possible. How does this make sense? How can this be legal? If this man doesn't get the punishment he deserves, who will? The frustration wasn't just about the case. It was about a legal system that seemed to favor predators over victims. If a crime this clear-cut, this horrifying could be reduced, what did that say about justice in Australia? Then came November 7th, 2007, the day Sophia's family would finally hear the court's decision. Dante Arthurs stood before the judge, his face void of emotion, as if the trial, the charges, and even Sophia's death meant nothing to him. Then, the judge delivered the sentence. life in prison, but with parole eligibility in just 13 years. 13 years, for brutally taking the life of an 8-year-old girl, for committing a crime so disturbing, so monstrous it had shaken an entire nation. 13 years was all it took before he could ask to walk free again. Sophia's family sat in stunned silence, not because they accepted it, but because they couldn't believe it. How could a man capable of such evil even have the possibility of getting out? How could the law allow this? This wasn't just about one man's sentence. This was about a system that had failed again and again. It was a system that ignored DNA evidence in 2003 and let a predator walk free, allowed a loophole to erase parts of his crime, handed down a sentence so weak it made the public lose faith in justice. The next day, newspaper headlines captured what everyone was feeling: a slap on the wrist for an unthinkable crime. Justice denied. How the system failed Sofia Rodriguez. He'll be out in 13 years. How is that even possible? The entire country was outraged. Sophia's father had rushed home from Hong Kong the moment he got the call about her murder. Now, standing outside the courtroom, he barely spoke to reporters. He simply said, "We don't understand. We just don't understand." Her mother? She couldn't even attend the sentencing. The pain was too much. Her siblings sat in the courtroom, listening as the judge handed their sister's murderer a future. He would serve his sentence, and then one day he could petition for freedom, for a second chance at life. Sophia would never get that chance, and yet the man who took her life still had a future. That reality, it was unbearable. But the anger didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. People demanded reforms. They wanted stricter sentencing, no more loopholes, and harsher punishments for repeat offenders. The public wasn't just fighting for Sophia anymore. They were fighting to make sure this never happened again. Because people knew, if this man could get a second chance, then so could others like him. And nobody was willing to let that happen again, not after Sophia. Then in 2019, Dante Arthurs had the first parole consideration. This was just 13 years after committing one of the most disturbing crimes in Australian history. The system was already entertaining the idea of setting him free. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the country. People were stunned. How could this even be a possibility? How could the justice system be so out of touch with reality that they would even consider allowing a known child predator and murderer to walk free? Within days, 120,000 people signed a petition demanding that Arthurs remain behind bars. Protesters gathered outside government buildings, refusing to stay silent. Talk radio stations were flooded with outraged callers, and social media became a war zone of anger and disbelief. The pressure mounted with each passing day, and as the parole board met to decide his fate, the public's outrage became impossible to ignore. After weeks of heated debate, after officials were forced to acknowledge the overwhelming opposition, the decision was made. His parole was denied. For Sophia's family, it was a temporary relief, but they knew this wasn't the end. The system had made it clear this fight would never be over. Because Dante Arthurs would get another chance, and another after that. And as long as he was alive, they would have to keep fighting again and again and again. And then, in mid-2022, it happened. Dante Arthurs was once again eligible for parole, and the fight to keep him behind bars reignited. This time, the public's anger burned even hotter. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a broken system that kept forcing victims' families to fight for justice that should have already been secured. The petition started again. The media ripped into the justice system, questioning why a man capable of such brutality was even allowed to request freedom. Calls for harsher sentencing laws grew louder. with legal experts pointing out that Australia's justice system had serious flaws when it came to repeat offenders. And finally, the parole board made its decision. Another denial. But this time there was a catch. They didn't permanently take away his eligibility for release. They didn't put an end to this nightmare. Instead, they only postponed it by 3 years. That meant in 2025, this battle would happen all over again. Sophia's family was devastated. How many more times would they have to stand before the board, pleading for their daughter's killer to remain behind bars? How many more times would they have to relive the trauma of that day? And what if, one day, the system actually let him? Sophia's story was more than just a tragedy. It was a failure at every level. Even after all these years, there are still too many unanswered questions. Questions that haunt Sophia's family and leave the public with a bitter taste of injustice. Despite the horrors of what happened, Sophia's memory wasn't erased. Her friends, the ones she used to laugh and play with, never forgot her. They performed the Indonesian dance routine she had been so excited about, but this time it was at her memorial. Instead of standing beside them, she was honored through their movements, their tears, their love for her that never faded. Her school, Mater Christi Catholic Primary, built a memorial chapel in her name, a place where students could come, reflect, and remember a girl whose life was taken far too soon. Even years later, her best friends still carry pendants with her face, engraved with 3 words that carry a lifetime of heartbreak and love. Best friends forever. Sophia's life was short, but her story left a mark on an entire nation. She should have been here. She should have celebrated her 28th birthday by November. But how? How was a known predator, a man with a history of attacking children, still free to roam a shopping center filled with families? How was it possible that the security cameras near the restroom were conveniently not working that day? Why was critical DNA evidence from 2003 ignored when testing it could have put him behind bars and prevented Sophia's murder altogether? How many other cases like this are just waiting to happen because of the same failures? Because someone's past crimes were overlooked? Because a loophole allowed justice to be watered down? Because the system protected the predator instead of the victim? The reality is, Sophia should still be alive today. She should have grown up, graduated high school, gone to college, and built a life of her own. Instead, her family is left with nothing but memories and a justice system that keeps reopening their wounds every time it considers granting her killer a second chance. Sophia's murder was a wake-up call for Australia. It exposed deep flaws in the justice system, and the public refused to stay silent. Because of the outrage, because people demanded better, laws were changed. Stricter parole rules were put in place. Sentences for child predators and violent offenders became tougher. And one of the biggest changes? The legal loophole that allowed sexual assault charges to be dropped simply because the victim was deceased. That loophole was closed. It took the loss of an innocent child to force a system to evolve, but the scars left behind were permanent. Instead, her family is still fighting, still reliving the nightmare, still making sure the man who stole her life is never allowed to take another step in freedom. And that isn't justice, but her name lives on. So what do you think about this case? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you feel the need to keep these stories alive, to give these victims a voice, please subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything, and it helps us keep telling the stories that need to be heard. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss out on future cases. Together, we can make sure that the truth doesn't get buried. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.